So good day everyone, I'm going to show you how to perform a two-sample independent t-test using SPSS. And let's look upon the data that we're using to perform. So this test is always the first and most important thing to do when performing any statistical test is to understand the data that you're working with. So in this particular data set, we have the weights of running shoes. The weights in ounces of a sample of running shoes for men and women are shown. This case, for example, you might notice here that gender is actually labeled as ones and twos. That is why it's important to look at the data set and understand how the data is being represented and what perform, and not only we know the gender but the weight in ounces of sample running shoes for men and women are shown. So gender is labeled as men, and group 2 is labeled as women. So let's determine the variable by clicking the variable view. So there's a name, type numeric, decimal 0, and values that is variable can take on. I can determine by clicking this. If I click, it tells me that 1 represents, again, group 1 represents men, 2 represents women. Now let's leave it as default. Now to compare the means of two groups, the weights in ounces of sample of running shoes for men and women. Before running the test in SPSS and then analyze the results, So this is the example of independent sample t-test using SPSS. First thing, to figure out what is our question. The question is there a statistical difference in weights running shoes of men versus women? My first group is going to be called group 1, which is men, group 2, which is women. Now, the null hypothesis is that there is no significant difference between the mean of the weight of running shoes of men and the mean of the weight of running shoes for women. And the alternative, meaning they are the same. And the alternative hypothesis is there is a significant difference between the mean of the weight of running shoes of men and the mean of the weight of running shoes for women, meaning they are different. In null, they are the same. In an alternative, they are different. So let's proceed to. So now, in order to perform this test, I'm going to go to into the SPSS, which is I'm here right now, and I'm going to click the analyze, and I'm going to compare means, that's what I'm going to do. I'm looking to the mean because two groups, and in this case I'm going to be using independent samples t-test. Why independent sample t-test? Because I have two separated values that I want to compare, men and women. As you can see, SPSS will ask what test variable you're using to compare your two groups and what your groups. So I'm going to define first the grouping variables. Now, next is how I'm going to define the groups. So let's define groups. So let's select group 1, which is the men, group 2, which is the women. So hit the continue. At the test variable, which is the running shoes. So that's all. So if I'm going to go to the option button, I want for this test button, it would ask me that what is my confidence interval. So the 95% tells me that my alpha value is 0.05, and that's what I want. So For this test, I'm going to leave it at it is. So click the continue. As you can see, there are two large boxes, which is the group statistic independent sample test, which is the t-test. First one shows us the mean of both group in group statistic box. It shows us the mean of both groups, and there are far apart guessing that there is going to be a significant difference. So you can see the mean of the men is 12.48 and the women is 9.94. So there's far apart between this mean between these two groups. So this is in the independent samples test. This is the result of the t-test. It shows the F test and its p-value. So I can determine whether or not to assume that my variance are equal. When I do that, and I know which row I'm using, I can determine what my t-test value and what my p-value and of the t-test value. So that we can give a final conclusion later on. First, we need to determine which of the rows, the top row or the bottom row, are we going to use to determine the final results or conclusion of our test. So first, you need to look upon this F test and P value. First, we need to determine the F test and the P value, which is here. That tells us whether or not, or we can assume that our two groups have equal variance or not. That's what this is all about. So how to determine if it's top row or bottom row? If our significance p-value for f-test is less than our alpha value or 0.05, our variance are not assumed to be equal. If this value is bigger than 0.05, then we can assume them to be equal. But in this case, our p-value is less than 0.05. And so the variance are not assumed to be equal. Now we will going to use the bottom because it's not assumed to be equal. Now we will going to use the bottom row. We know that the alpha value is 0.05. For our test, we can see here that our t value is 5.10 and the p value that t-test is 0.000, which is in this case we can reject the null hypothesis. Therefore, there is a significant difference between weight of running shoes of men and weight of running shoes for women. That's all.